Welcome into the Living Room Disciple Podcast. Today we are joined again by Catherine McNiel, who was with us back in episode 40. But today she joins us for a conversation about her wonderful book, Fearing Bravely. Scripture says that perfect love casts out fear, and we desperately need to be shaped by that love in today's world where we're taught who and what to fear everywhere we turn. Catherine helps us to see how love can actually overcome fear and how we can follow Christ in learning to love our neighbors and our enemies. All that and more on today's episode of the Living Room Disciple Podcast, where discipleship finds a home. We're so glad you are with us today. And if you are watching on YouTube, you recognize a familiar face because we are with Catherine McNiel. And Catherine, this is your second time with us. Welcome in. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. And if a listener is thinking, oh no, I missed that first episode, I need to go listen to that first, it's actually not related even a little bit. And
That's
so
true.
we're going to have a totally different conversation about your book, Fearing Bravely, which I got to read over the last month or so. And man, what a powerful book. Yes, there's the image. Love it. Powerful book, challenging, confronting in all the best ways, and really honest about what the New Testament has to say about how we should be formed towards loving our neighbors and our enemies. Can you actually share the subtitle with us? I don't remember it, but it's something right along those lines, right?
The book is called Fearing Bravely, Risking Love for Our Neighbors, Strangers, and Enemies.
Yes, so good.
Yeah, I don't necessarily get to title the book, but it was really important to me that love for our neighbors, strangers, and enemies was in there because that's what it's about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so kind of what led you to write this? What was your heart behind it? What was your heart for when somebody picked it up? What did you want them to take away?
Well, when I pick up the Bible, whether it's the Old Testament in the Pentateuch or in the prophets, or the New Testament, Jesus speaking to his followers, or in the epistles, no matter where I pick up the Bible, I hear this really repeated message. I was going to say loud, but I don't want to say loud. It's a gentle message, but it is over and over and over again that God is love, that people who follow God need to be people known for their compassion, known for their care, their provision for others. And Jesus and the prophets and the law and the epistles just keep expanding who that entails. Like, love your neighbor. That's literally what Jesus says all the law is about. And then when he gets questioned, he's like, well, it kind of means anybody who's in need. Like a stranger, absolutely a stranger. If it's your enemy, well, you should love your enemy. And it's just, as Jesus is in dialogue with his followers about what this actually means in real life, like I said, the boundaries just keep expanding until you're like, wait, there's nobody on the other side of this.
Yeah.
And Jesus said, that's the number one thing. Like, love God and love your neighbor. Like, they're right there.
Right. It's like we keep trying to find exceptions, and he's like, nope, not that one either.
Nope, not that one either.
Nope. Yeah, exactly. Man, that's so good. But on the flip side, he had to say that for a reason, because we do try to find exceptions. We do find ways to, and it's not just because we are awful people or terrible people or want to hate others, but we are constantly discipled towards fear. And that's something you write about a lot in the book. So what are some ways that you would say that we are discipled towards fear?
Oh, man, I see it every day, Nick, like 10 times at least. I guess I should have given a two-part answer to your first question, that every time I open the Bible, I hear this compelling invitation, command to love, no matter who it is. If we're representing God, we're representing with compassion. But then on the other hand, the rhetoric that I'm hearing everywhere I go, whether I'm turning on the television or I'm scrolling Twitter, now X, or listening to podcasts or turning on the radio or just walking with friends, I'm hearing so much fear. And I'm hearing all these reasons why it's dangerous now, all these reasons why we should be wary. And the interesting thing is that it's pretty clear that Jesus wasn't safe when he said to love his neighbors and even strangers and even enemies because they killed him. And he was pretty clear that that's how this was going to end. but he said to do it anyway. And
Mm.
If we are going to be resurrection people who no longer need to fear death or the grave because God has triumphed over those things, and if God has said, you're going to be known by my love, my actual followers will be known by your love,
Yeah.
then that's where fearing bravely comes in, because we are afraid. We have good
Yeah.
reason to be afraid, but that doesn't change our marching orders, which are to be in the world in a way that is love and compassion.
Absolutely. And so, what would you say are some of the messages that the things that you're hearing 10 times a day? What are some of the messages that might produce fear of the other in us
Yeah.
versus love of an enemy that can turn into a neighbor?
I hear about dangerous neighborhoods, dangerous
Mm.
schools. I hear about dangerous um, immigrants coming in, trying to steal something from us, trying to take something. I hear that the world is more dangerous now than it used to be. I hear that we need to spend our time and our energy and our attention on corporations or politicians or pastors that have this insight and can save us or can protect us from these dangers that they're constantly warning us about. And that raises my suspicions, because that doesn't sound like a Christian way of viewing things. That doesn't sound
Yeah.
like Christian discipleship, but it is discipleship. We are being discipled, but the voices that I'm hearing are discipling us towards fear rather
Right.
than towards love.
Yeah. I remember growing up and watching Saturday morning cartoons or anything else. And just all through the day as a kid, I remember there would constantly be these ADT ads that first their goal was not to get you to want their security system. Their first goal was to convince you that somebody's probably going to try to break into your house. And
Yeah.
it works the same way where we have, like you said, all these different people who are speaking into our lives, and their first job is not to convince you I'm the good guy. Their first job is to convince you there's a bad guy coming, and that is what
Yes,
means you need me to be the good guy.
that's
And
exactly right.
I think fear is a powerful tool, and
It
if we
is.
aren't paying attention to who's trying to get me to be afraid of other people,
Mm-hmm.
then we are really susceptible to it, because it's intrinsic to who we are.
It
That
is.
fear is something God has given us, and
Yes. Yeah.
fear is something that we ought to use. Like when COVID hit, there were things to be
Mm-hmm.
afraid of, rightfully so,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
But when we are told that somebody who we shouldn't be afraid of is scary,
Right.
for no reason other than somebody wants to make money or wants to get elected or wants to sell you a
Right.
product or whatever it is, that's when we can so easily be malformed away from the message of Jesus.
Yes.
So what are some ways that you would maybe add to that and say that fear takes away from our ability to love our neighbor?
Well, man, I love so much of what you just said, namely that I don't want to lose sight of your core question, but I kind of want to do an on ramp to it.
Yeah,
I
go for
did
it.
a lot of research into
Mm,
how fear is good. Like
yeah,
if when I touch the stove and it's very hot, if I don't have like a warning sign, I'm going to lose my
right.
hand. It was a long and grueling process for my toddlers to realize they can't run out into the street in front of our house, or they
Yes.
will they will I can't finish the sentence, but it will be
Yeah.
bad for them. We
Right.
need fear to keep us in a healthy space, but it does get exploited, and it's very intentional. I've also done a lot of research into how movements around the world intentionally exploit the fear of the common person in order to move them and to kind of
Yeah.
create to create an army. And it often starts with our language and how we're willing to talk about people as though they were very scary, as though they were less than human. Um,
Mm,
Dehumanizing language, and you can hear that every day, talking about
yeah.
people, very powerful, very popular people, describing the very ones that we are called to love and to serve, even sacrificially, even when it's dangerous, even when it costs us something. When those people are being described as vermin or aliens, that has an impact on our ability to see them as brothers and sisters. Um, that's been scientifically proven. And I have lost track of your question, just like I knew I would.
That's okay.
But,
and
okay.
It harms our ability to see the image of God too.
Yeah. And I have a story that I think maybe gets at what if I recall your original question.
Yeah.
But a while back, at least in my area, there's a social media site called Nextdoor, and it's really just for the people in our neighborhood.
Right.
But I'm in the Chicago suburbs, so my neighborhood is pretty big. So I didn't know the specific family, but I know roughly where they live, and it's a very safe neighborhood, shall we say. And they posted that someone had rung their doorbell, and when they looked out the window, they saw like maybe a woman in her early 20s approaching the door, ringing the bell, and then just kind of looking disoriented for a minute and then walking back to the car and driving away. And they posted this saying, "What was this?" And initially the comments were like someone like had the wrong door. Maybe they were going to a book club, or they were going to go babysitting, or they were dropping off DoorDash, and they thought they were in the right place and they realized they weren't. But really, really quickly, it snowballed to this is why we need to be armed, like you should call the police next time right away, or send your husband out with a gun. And it was so poignant to me because, like you said, if we are told over and over again every single day that someone is coming to harm us, that's going to be how our instincts are trained. But what if she did have a gun? What if she did call the police? And what if the woman was just looking for a book club? Or if she was going to pick up her little sister from a friend's house and she just got the wrong door?
Had the wrong address, yeah.
The homeowner, in a valiant attempt to save her own family, is actually going to commit an egregious act of unwarranted violence on an innocent person. And that's, I think, why Jesus' message is so important, and why I think neighbors and strangers and enemies all have to be included here. Because when we see strangers as enemies rather than as neighbors, we become the dangerous people that create the enemies. We become the enemies. We see ourselves as the good guys. We don't even realize that we have become dangerous. And I see that happening in our country and in our churches.
Yeah, that's a profound paradox, that we can actually be so afraid that we create danger where there is none.
Exactly.
Yeah, wow. And I can't think of hardly anything that is less like the way of Jesus, who goes where there is danger and then refuses to play that game.
Yeah.
Just like lays down his life.
Lays down his life for his enemies.
Yeah, powerful testimony. Yeah, exactly right. And prays forgiveness over them as they take his life.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's confronting.
And defeats death in the process.
Exactly right. Yeah. Amen. So you mentioned that this is not just something that happens out there in the scary world, or out there where the bad people are in the secular world or in the media or whatever. It also can happen in the doors of our churches.
Absolutely.
It can happen in our faith communities. And so what are some ways that you've seen that work, that you've seen us actually traffic fear versus promoting love?
Wow. Well, so much I think of the discipleship that we are receiving from the secular world has infiltrated our churches. And I think a lot of times we are being discipled by fear in our churches as well. Messages that are maybe useful to bring power to a political party or a political candidate are couched in religious language. So it sounds like, the good guys are going to fight against this, or the really good people, the good Americans, the good Christians are going to be warning each other about that. And it definitely gets it filters into our Christian messages, because we grow confused about what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus in an empire like America.
Yeah, and oftentimes I think our fights, and this is not to play the both sides card or whatever, but it seems like a lot of times our fights are really competing in the church, and specifically within American evangelicalism, are this competition between these are the scary people. No, these are the scary people.
Yeah.
No, these are the and we're just going back and forth saying like, who should our people be afraid of? And so the average Christian who is looking for leadership and looking for guidance and looking for their pastors and leaders and Christian authors and musicians and stuff to kind of guide them and help them understand how is God moving and what is the Bible trying to tell me? And instead, the message that we're often receiving is, don't go anywhere near that person. Don't go anywhere near that theology. Don't go anywhere near. And so rather than pointing people to the true and the good and the beautiful, and right, Philippians 4:8, think about these such things. Instead of that, we're playing defense all the time and saying, be afraid of them and be afraid of that and be afraid of that doctrine and don't get anywhere near that. And this happens in so many different churches and denominations where the very people that, these people are lifting up this guy or this theology, and then these people are saying, no, don't do that. And I can imagine it being so confusing for a new Christian or just the average person sitting in the pew. Not only confusing, but as we've been talking about, malforming us, discipling us towards fear.
It absolutely is. Because who are we to avoid if we are to love our neighbors and strangers and enemies? And sometimes we do have to be very discerning. I think we do need to be discerning. This is not a Pollyannish perspective in which, if we could all just get along, let's all just sit in a circle and sing a song together. Like that's overcoming evil with good, like Paul says, is a bold and strong stance. It's not a weak, mellow stance. If we are going to overcome evil with good, that's not just joining hands in a circle. That's going to take a lot of hard work, but it does mean we're going to have to go into the neighborhoods that we've said are scary, or the schools that we are afraid are harming our children, or the groups of people that we think of as them, or that we think of as enemies. If you hear yourself or someone else describing someone as taking over our country or ruining our values, or that, those are the people we need to be getting to know, right? Because at minimum, we need to be serving them. And if there are neighborhoods or schools that we see as dangerous, then it's also dangerous for the people who live there, and it's dangerous for the people who go to school there. And how can we overcome that evil with goodness?
Right. And I think it can also convince us that we are somehow more important, or our lives are more valuable, or our children are more valuable than their families or their children, or they are, because they have to face that day to day, but it's not safe for me to go serve in that neighborhood, or whatever. And I think we can receive this message over and over again.
And I hear a lot of people when I'm on podcasts, or readers will reach out to me through my website or social media to say, okay, like, let's get down to brass tacks though. Like most of the time I'm just going to work and I'm trying to feed my children and then get to bed, like, how am I going to overcome evil with good? And I have two things that I kind of start with. And the first is, this isn't a me issue. This is an us ball game. None of us can do this together. We have to do it together. None of us can do this alone. We have to do it together. And that's the whole purpose of the body of Christ. That's the whole idea of being salt. It's just one little flake of salt. I'm not sure that salt comes in flakes, but one little something of salt here and another one there and another one here, another one there. That's the metaphor of being the light of the world. A light here, a light there, a light there. And as for what it looks like, what I really hope is that people who want to follow Jesus will get together and read the book, or don't read the book, read the Gospel of Luke, and ask yourselves, like, what would this look like? What would it look like if we actually tried to follow Jesus in our neighborhood? And then I think it'll come to light, as if we were actually willing to sit down and think about it. Together.
For sure. Yes. Amen. And then to pivot completely hopefully not undermine what you just said. There is this big like societal version of this where we're taught on a corporate level to fear these kinds of people or whatever.
Yeah.
But there's also to do the exact opposite. There are individual relationships where we would say that person either really gets under my skin and just kind of annoys me and I don't want to be around them, or maybe this person has really actually hurt me, or maybe I really don't like the effects that this person has on my family. Or there are individual relationships where we maybe wouldn't use the word enemy, but practically we're probably talking about an enemy. What would you say if somebody is saying, I don't know how to start to approach these big societal things other than just getting in community and talking about them? What would you say to the person who's saying, I'm really struggling with this person in my life and feeling like they're my enemy and I don't know how to love them?
Yeah. Well, one of the coolest things that I found in my research for this book was there are some scholars who think that when Jesus said, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, like it sounds like poetic language, like saying the same thing twice, but there is at least some evidence. Like, I'm not going to say like this is for sure what Jesus had in mind, but there's at least some evidence that when he said love your enemies, he meant do specific acts of service for the people that you just cannot stand. That person that is so annoying to you, that just grates on you, or that you see as less than. As someone that you see as unworthy of the American dream, or an invitation to the table. Like, whoever it is that you think is odious, do acts of service, like actively love that person. But then pray for those who persecute you. That's a little bit different. That's someone who is actively harming you or would actively harm you if they had access to you. So I definitely, and I hope everyone hears me, I don't think Jesus is saying to, for example, an abused woman, like, go back and cook dinner for that husband that you're trying, that the police just helped you leave. Like, I am confident Jesus is not saying that. But maybe we can get to a place where we can pray for the people who are harming us. And that's something we can do from a safe distance. But if you are someone who really is afraid of or angry about immigrants or LGBTQ community or what have you, a different race, then maybe those are the people that you need to be actively serving, because that's not going to cause you any harm. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but at minimum, I think we can start with praying. And if it's a safe person that just annoys you to death, look for ways that you can serve them. Yeah.
Serve and love those that annoy you, and pray from a distance for those that could actively harm you.
Yes.
As we're recording this, just about a week ago, Bible Project has been going through a series on the Sermon on the Mount in their podcast, and they just released their episode on if somebody strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek. If somebody asks you to go a mile with them, go 2. If somebody asks for your coat, give them your shirt too, or vice versa. And I can't possibly explain everything that they said in that 45 minutes or so. So please, if you're listening to this, go and listen to that episode, because the way they described it was, because those all sound like somebody's hurting you, just let them keep trampling on you, just be a doormat. But the way they described it in the ancient context, and they brought up different like ancient texts that had similar wording and things like that to explain what those things meant. And in those contexts, those were all ways that were kind of related to like the civil rights movement and nonviolent resistance. So the first one, just to go with an example, is the turn the other cheek, where they were talking about how they have ancient texts where striking somebody on the right cheek would mean striking them with the back of your right hand. And that was a way to strike an inferior. So then if you stand back up and say, strike me on the other cheek as well, then you're saying, strike me as an equal. So it's a way of you're not gonna hit them back and say, no, you're my inferior. You're gonna assert, see me as the image of God, see me as your brother and sister, and then do that again.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
And then, right? And then the other two had very similar kind of like, you need to see me as the image of God and treat me as the image of God, and then I'm going to keep serving you.
Yeah.
And you can, it just is basically showing like,
right.
I'm going to show you how you're actually behaving, and you're going to see how foolish you look by treating me this way. While still loving them and serving them and refusing
Right.
to fight back or fight fire with fire.
Yeah.
So yeah, just such creative and powerful ways of loving people that we don't even think about, because we just jump so quickly to, how do I get back at them, or how do I just run away, or whatever. But there are so many powerful, creative ways. Thinking back, you mentioned earlier about the prophets and how they spread this message as well, and just all the creative ways that the prophets found to try to communicate their message to Israel. They weren't just standing on a mountain saying stuff. They were acting out their message.
Yeah.
And I think there are so many ways that we can do that. So many ways that we can stop this cycle of fear and violence. And one of my favorite lines in your book, you said, somebody must stop the cycle.
Yeah.
And so I've been thinking over the last probably 6 months, I've been obsessed with atonement theories and just trying to get to the bottom of like, what happened on the cross.
Me too.
Just trying to figure it out. I love it. But I think this is one that we often neglect, that the cross is Christ's refusal to participate in the cycle of fear and violence.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so one of the ways that he defeats sin and death is by refusing to play sin and death's game.
Yeah.
And not beating it on its own terms, but playing an entirely different game.
Yeah.
And so how would you say that Christ's cross both stops the cycle of fear and violence, but also is an example for us in how to do the same?
Oh man, I wish I was not bound by the boundaries of language, because I think if I had a few hours to I could come up with a really beautiful, compelling way to say this, but it still wouldn't be good enough. But I think as we look through the ancient world, both in the Bible and outside the Bible, we see that there are people who harm each other, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose, out of vindictiveness. And even though it doesn't look the same now, we still see it today. It's not an ancient world thing. But they did come up with some boundaries, like if somebody accidentally kills your donkey, like you get to have a donkey, like they have to give you a donkey, but you cannot go and like burn their whole barn down. Like you get a donkey, and so they were trying to create a balance. But if somebody purposefully kills your donkey, then so there was an understanding that there is a need for the person who has suffered to be paid back. But that there also has to be a boundary around that, because we lose our temper. We go a little crazy. But then what if it's not your donkey? Like, what if it's your brother? And what ends up happening is, somebody accidentally kills your brother, and then you go and you burn their village down, but then what are their cousins going to do? And then what are your cousins going to do? And it just snowballs. And as much as we would love to say that we've kind of evolved beyond that, I mean, like, just go on social media or the comments on the internet somewhere. We are doing the exact same thing, maybe not with machetes or donkeys, but we're still like, we recognize someone from another tribe based on the language that they're using or the stand that they're taking. And we don't say, hey, brother, hey, sister, I'd like to better understand, the emotions behind that perspective. And what is the hurt that has motivated you to take that stand? And then listen for a really long time and then say, if you don't mind, I'd like to share why my life experiences, we don't do that. We just start attacking each other.
Yeah.
So I think in Jesus, we believe that Jesus was God. And when he was preparing to walk into the city for the Passover festival, it was obvious to everybody that a confrontation was about to take place, because he had been confronting the religious leaders and the political leaders and the wealthy people and the powerful people, because they were exploiting the persons who were trusting, the people who were trying to survive, the people who were looking to God, who were trying to worship. They were being exploited for power, for wealth. And Jesus kept on confronting them, and it was not going well. And it even says in the Bible that, they got together and they said, we need to silence this guy. We got to knock this off. But a lot of people thought he really was the Messiah. So they wanted to come along and see what was going to happen, because this was going to be fireworks. This was going to be big time. But amazingly, God, even God, especially God, did not see this power as something to be grasped, but made himself nothing and took on the form of a servant and was obedient even to death on the cross. And he basically said, God said, guys, wrap your mind around this. Yeah. God, the one who created the universe, the one who oversaw the eclipse that we had a few weeks ago, God, Alpha and Omega, came in a body and said, this has to stop. You want to murder somebody? You want to get vengeance? You want to hang on to power? It's going to be my body. And then I'm not going to have vengeance on you. I'm going to say, okay, absorbed. Be done now. And so God's body was broken by vengeful and terrified people. Another part in the gospel shows that the religious leaders were scared of Jesus because the Romans were powerful and they would kill a lot of people if they thought that there was an uprising. And Jesus was creating an uprising. And so they said, wouldn't it be better for him to die than for many of us to die? And so some of them were vindictive, some of them were power hungry, some of them were just scared. And that's what we are. And God said, let's put that energy onto me. Stop harming each other. I'm going to absorb this, and then I'm going to be planted in the ground, in the garden, and from me will come new life. And that's just the most amazing idea ever. And if we are going to be resurrection people, that's the story that should form us. That's the story that should say to us, okay,
right.
Let's have a different way of being in the world because we're following Jesus, the God who took all this vengeance and fear in his body. And it killed him, but he is alive. And so what do we have to fear? What do we have to fear?
Yeah.
And I realize I'm preaching now. But I do say that on the one hand, and on the other hand, I'm a woman. I'm a mom. I know all the things we have to fear, I do. Yeah. And so I'm not going to just take my children and walk into a war zone and say, I believe in the living God. What do I have to fear? I am afraid. That's why I asked my publisher to keep the word fear in the title, because I don't want to say we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to be, but we are. But there is a bigger story, a more powerful story, and it's that God's own body was broken in this revenge cycle and is alive, and he is pointing out the path to eternal life.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop preaching.
I feel like everyone should pause the podcast and take a praise break of some kind. I don't know what that means exactly, but man, that was awesome. Now I forgot what I was going to say, but that's okay because it gives some extra time to think more about what you just said.
Everyone take a deep breath.
That's right. No, but it strikes me how the first step of Christ inaugurating a new creation world, story, narrative, a new creation, the first step of that is allowing the cycle to stop with him, allowing fear and death to crush him. So the first thing that happens in the new creation is the resurrection of Christ, but you don't get the resurrection of Christ without him submitting to that death.
Right. But he doesn't retaliate. He retaliates with life. His next move is not to cut everyone down. It's not to kill his enemies. It's to create new life.
Exactly. To create a new way and to say, come follow me, come be a part of this brand new way of living. And the first Christians called themselves the way, not the doctrine or not the theology, but the way.
Yeah.
One of the most powerful scriptures for me over the past couple months has been this moment where Jesus is standing before Pilate and he's just refusing to answer him. And Pilate plays the game, right? He's in the cycle. His power is death and threats and fear and violence. That is his power because that's Caesar's power, and he fights under Caesar.
Yeah.
And so he's questioning Jesus, and Jesus just stands there silent. And finally he says, "You're not going to answer me? Don't you understand that I have the power to kill you?" And it's just this poignant moment of Pilate. He doesn't know who he's talking to. He doesn't understand that he's talking to God in the flesh.
Yeah.
And he says, "Don't you understand that I have the power to take your life away?" And I just, if he could understand that Jesus, he was talking to the person, the only being that has ever been, that will ever be, that doesn't just have the power to take life away, but the power to create life from nothing.
Yeah.
Like the power of death is nothing. Yeah. The power of death is useless. The power of death is ridiculous. Jesus has the power to create life, not take. Anyone can take away life. Jesus can create life.
Yeah.
And so Pilate wielding this cycle of fear and death in front of Jesus, like it's the folly of, oh, that's that. Yeah. I've seen a lot of people play that game before. That game doesn't get you anywhere. And Jesus just stands and takes it because he's like, I'm not going to stoop to your level.
Yeah.
And then in doing so, in the resurrection, creates a brand new way to be human, and we come alive in that.
Yes.
And so it's one thing to just talk about this and to say, wow, God is so good and all of that. And we should do that. But this is a podcast about spiritual formation and discipleship. And so how would you say we should be discipled by the resurrection? How should the resurrection allow perfect love to cast out fear in us?
Well, I am a word person, so I am going to say I'd love for it to start with conversation. And that's what I'm always saying. We have not overcome evil with good yet. So it's probably not going to happen in the next 10 years, but we all have seen stories. We've seen pockets where evil has been overcome by good, or where, I'm skipping to the second half of the phrase, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. We can be not overcome.
Yeah.
And so I do, let's just watch our words. Like, do not tolerate calling anybody an alien, a varmint, any kind of dehumanizing language. We have to use human language. Like, would you be okay with your sister being spoken of that way, of your son? Are we cultivating ourselves to be people of compassion and empathy? Are we listening to stories? If we hear of just a news story or a headline that just sounds just so scathingly wrong, like, are we doing a little bit of research to see, well, what was happening? Why were those people doing what they did? Like, is this a vulnerable person, or is this a vulnerable person seeking flourishing? Or is this a powerful person seeking more power? And I think we have to love both. But it's going to impact what that love looks like a lot when we start using some discernment to form ourselves and to form each other. And I do think our language right now, it's so much depends on our language. So much of the atrocities in the world were committed because over a period of time, and it's not very much time, or just a matter of years, normal people, good people like you and me were taught to use dehumanizing language for others, and then they were taught to be afraid, and then they were taught that they were threatened, and then they were willing to either sit by while horrible things were done or to do those things themselves because they had been discipled to see that this was the good thing to do. This was fighting for goodness, but it isn't. That is the revenge cycle, and it is often used on the most vulnerable people among us. So again, I think I've maybe lost sight of your question, but I do just want us to watch our words so carefully and watch our hearts. Watch our words and watch our hearts.
I think that's so valid because I think it can be so tempting not just to be the person that either goes to a political rally or something and shouts down people that you don't like, or logs on, probably more likely logs on to Facebook or Instagram or Twitter and does the same thing. It's easy to say, well, I don't do that. But
Mm.
how easy is it for us to react to somebody else doing that by doing the exact
Yeah.
same thing?
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes Jesus, and then people who followed in Jesus' footsteps in many ways, from Gandhi to Martin Luther King Jr.,
Yeah.
people that said, I'm going to refuse to play that game, and you're going to shout insults at me and push me down and be violent with me, and I'm just going to refuse to do it back, even though you probably deserve it more than I do because of the way you're treating me. And especially in Jesus's case, as a completely innocent person who deserved none of it. He had every right in the world to push back, and he refused.
Yeah.
So I think part of what the resurrection can do for us is to say, I don't have to stoop to your level. I don't have to play that game with you. I serve a God who lives again, and my life is eternally rooted in him.
Yeah.
Love is going to overcome evil with good.
Yes.
Yeah.
The darkness
Man.
cannot overcome it. Yep. And
Exactly right.
even though I do keep getting off on deeply theological bunny trails, in the book itself, I tell stories about neighborhoods and kids playing and people eating dinner together. And I talk about strangers that I've met, and strangers who have helped me, and strangers I've been able to help, and strangers who didn't help me. And I talk about enemies, and I talk about actual enemies that have done harm to my family and the ways that I've wrestled with it. And I give ideas of what normal people can do, and even songs you can listen to, and paintings you can look at. And because we really do, I think we do need to grapple with this big idea that God is love, and in him there is no darkness at all. And that the Jesus story is proving God to be non-vindictive, non-violent. But then to figure out what that looks like today or tomorrow, and in my family, and on the weekend, and after school, and before I go to work, like that's where the rubber meets the road. And
absolutely.
And that's where I'm hoping my stories can help to point us.
Yeah, praise God. I think that's incredibly helpful, and I cannot recommend this book enough. So please go and purchase and read "Fearing Bravely" by Catherine McNiel. Such a wonderful book. And one of the things, I think you actually had it in there twice, if I remember right. It's this exercise that I would love for you to share with the listeners that helps us learn to love enemies by first picturing them within God's love. So would you mind sharing that exercise with us as a practical next step from this conversation?
Do you mind if I read it?
Please. Okay,
this is, if you have a copy of the book, this is on page 192. If I'm getting the one that you're thinking of. This is kind of a riff on something that I did not invent called the loving kindness meditation. I don't know. Some people will have heard of that. A lot of people won't have. But here's how I applied it to this book and to the idea of loving our enemies. During a time of quiet prayer, imagine yourself surrounded by God's love. Then bring to mind your loved ones and widen the space to include them. Then, recall people you don't know very well or have neutral feelings about, and allow the space of God's grace and love to cover them too. Finally, bring to mind enemies, one at a time. Don't begin this process with the person who has harmed you the most. Choose instead someone who frustrates you or annoys you. Bit by bit, day by day, expand this circle a bit further in your mind. If the process becomes traumatic, go back to the beginning and rest in God's spacious love. Contact a friend, pastor, spiritual director, or therapist if you need help. Take your time. This is a lifelong practice and not something to complete in one sitting. Then I have a few other tips for kind of widening that circle. And but even though not much gets done while I'm sitting on a chair in my living room or on the floor of my bedroom, I find value in practicing in my mind, saying God's love is here and I am inside of it. And man, I do talk a lot about that in this book, that the starting point of all this is that we are already deeply and fully and eternally loved. We don't need to be afraid of God. We don't need to be afraid of being unloved. We don't need to be afraid of being cast out. What we need is to learn to see that love, to rest in that love, to remember that love. And so that's the first step, is God is remembering God's love is here. It is abundant. It is poured out. God took on a body to prove that to us.
Yeah.
And then to rest in that. And then as we get better at that, then start expanding it to the people that are easy for us to love. And then slowly, bit by bit, and it's a practice, so it's not something we're going to sit down and excel at right away, but bit by bit, expand that vision to include even the people we maybe wish it didn't include. And as our imagination and our mind changes, our heart will change. And as our heart changes, our words will change, because from the outpouring of our heart, the mouth speaks. And as our words change, I pray that our behavior will change. And if I have spent some time every day or once a week or once a month or once in a lifetime imagining God's love encompassing that person or that group of people that I view as just so unworthy, that's going to change the way I talk about them. And it's, like I said, hopefully it will change the way I act in the world.
Yeah. Amen. Well, what a beautiful way to finish this conversation. A beautiful way to remember that before we are anything else, we are loved by God. And that is true for our enemy as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Catherine, so much for being with us today. It was a joy to talk to you.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you, reader out there. I hope that you can feel loved and brave today.
Well, thank you for listening today, and I hope you were as blessed by Catherine as I was. Fearing Bravely is available anywhere books are sold, and you can find Catherine on Twitter at Catherine McNiel. I want to thank Micah Pop for producing this episode, Eric Church for getting it out to you, and Daniel Ramirez for the theme song. As we conclude, my prayer for you is the same as Paul's prayer in Ephesians 3, that you would be rooted and grounded in God's love, that together with all of God's holy people, you would gain the strength to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of the Messiah, that you may know this love that surpasses knowledge, and that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. May God's love overflow in us to spread to our neighbors, strangers, and enemies. See you next time on the Living Room Disciple Podcast, where discipleship finds a home.